Hi, let's talk about Gears of War. So, 2006 title for the Xbox 360, ported to the PC in 2007. It's a third-person shooter. The lovely Cliff Bleszinski is partially responsible for this dumpster fire, and Epic Games is the main developer. So now Epic Games is known for Fortnite, but in the past they were known for shooters, right? Actual shooters, not Fortnite. Eventually they would go on to make in conjunction with People Can Fly, Bulletstorm, which is a game that I have also done a very old playthrough of, and I'm a little bit familiar with as well. But back in the day of the era of Gears of War, they had already sort of fallen out of favor because their romps with the more recent Unreal tournaments have not really been very successful. Generally speaking, they were, I don't know how financially successful they were, but most of the people that enjoyed the earlier Unreal tournaments did not enjoy the later ones. And that's what was basically Epic Games' main calling card, is that they were behind Unreal Tournament. And so coming into Gears of War, it's the pilot of an existing, now like very long-lasting and lengthy in terms of the number of titles franchise. And this very, this pilot game, this first episode, if you will, is supposed to essentially allow us to understand where the franchise went and where they decided to take it. Now, I can't really comment too much on the future titles because I'd rather back up some of that stuff, some of my observations, some of my opinions with a demonstration of what those games look like. And I haven't been able to play them yet, so we're just going to be mostly talking about this game. But I think it does, it bears repeating, it's worth noting that the franchise overall has been a commercial success. And I think that's interesting because I guess it was one of the last franchises to be established and then to still have stuff, more than 10 years since Gears of War originally shipped is somewhat noteworthy. You don't really see new franchises or new content being produced at any point. I don't know if this is based off of a book or something. I didn't see anything in the Wikipedia article here, but I did see some information about the PC port, which was a little bit of a point of contention during the playthrough. I wasn't sure if this content was originally developed for the Xbox 360 version. I kind of assumed it was cut content that they just sort of half-assedly implemented later on for the PC version. But they don't make any note of that, and I haven't bothered to do any further research to whether or not, verify whether or not that is true. So I guess we'll just assume that this content was developed for the PC version exclusively. Maybe they had some elements of it, partially finished or something similar to, the example I always provide is before Brood War shipped, before news of Brood War was even existing, when Vanilla was shipping, there were cutscenes of like a work in progress desert tile set and an ice tile set, and the Valkyrie was in these screenshots and all sorts of other stuff. So you had some understanding of, that Blizzard was partially done with the content that would eventually ship in Brood War. And so you could kind of assume something similar probably happened, where there were some drafts, at the very least, of the content that we played that was PC exclusive in this playthrough. Now, that was content that was completely new to me. I've only played this on the 360 beforehand. So it's interesting to see that content, but ultimately it does feel like cut content, like bonus scenes, deleted scenes, that were not ever properly polished and ready for release. Now, interestingly enough, I think there actually is a DLC for the second or the third game called Gears of War Deleted Scenes. I think it was the second game, where it's just a DLC story chapter, and it's Marcus and Dom like putting on Locust gear or something to infiltrate stuff. It's like very much something that doesn't really feel super threaded and grounded in the main narrative of that game or the franchise as a whole. And so I can understand why it was cut at the end of the day. It's interesting that they wound up releasing it as DLC. I don't know. You can have a cynical view on that, and you can also say, like, hey, maybe they're just trying to find interesting ways to work that content in because they really believed that it was good content and they wanted people to see it. I would side more so on the cynical side just in general because DLC typically is not that great. It wasn't a very lengthy experience, and I'm pretty sure it was like 10 or 15 bucks when it retailed, so you can imagine that it was certainly whelming, underwhelming, I would suggest, when it comes to like the bang for your buck. But I just wanted to establish that because that is sort of related to what we're talking about, where maybe there's like a track record here where you can look at least with the Gears of War franchise, Epic Games pushing out content that was not finished or cut from the main game, literally calling something deleted scenes as a DLC, might make you think that. So The reason why that is important, the reason why that is an important sort of justification or distinction to make, is that, as I just implied by slipping up and saying justification, that content did not justify itself. That content did not, adequately engage the player. There was a lot of wasted time in this title overall, even in the main story, which is 100% one-to-one as far as I can tell. Just the extra content was very much like tacked on, I felt. It did not feel super grounded in the narrative. Sure, it makes sense, but it feels more like it's just another thing for our heroes, our characters, to deal with in their laundry list of things to deal with. And it doesn't necessarily feel like it contributes to their character development, to the narrative's development, to the settings development. It certainly doesn't engage the player on a gameplay sense, but most of the game didn't, so that's not necessarily 100% like something that you can look at and say, like, well, this is criticism only for this cut content, or these deleted scenes, or these new additions to the PC version. So this bonus content, isn't that different when it comes to the gameplay aspect, because as I said, it doesn't engage you. It's very much roundabout, but it was also not very well tested. You could very easily see this by the checkpoint system and how poor the checkpoints were placed, how poorly they were placed. So when you have stuff like, really, really lengthy, like minute-long diatribes where you can't talk at all, you can't progress, you can't even fucking move half the time, and you have that right after a checkpoint. Like, that's very obvious, I would think, that you wouldn't want to do that. And yet, they did that. It's like, that's not even something that I can imagine is a bug or an error that you would make as a level designer and as, like, whoever's running the triggers for the cutscenes and stuff. Nobody would make that issue in general. Like, you would have to really be asleep at the wheel to accidentally do that. And then the first time you test it, you say, oh shit, I gotta fix this. And so, like, unless it's just arcane syndrome where people are playing with cheats on and they're not actually playing the game, I don't see how that could slip past QA. But, I wasn't there. I wasn't part of the development team, so I'm sure there's probably some story that absolves them of guilt in theory. But at the end of the day, that all washes away. I mean, this is the product I played, and that's an inexcusable issue, in my opinion. So maybe that's just a microcosm of the game just having very strange checkpoint systems, just having a really, really strange and destructive penchant for interrupting the game flow with really long or just intrusive cutscenes, even if they weren't very long, that, relegated your movement to slow walking, sometimes in the middle of combat, notably, where you just sort of desynced the situation, which might be a PC port issue, and it might just be something that was rarely discussed or rarely encountered in the Xbox 360 version due to the fact that people were playing with a controller, and so they didn't have as much precision. But I don't know exactly how I was able to desync some of the things in this game, and I will assume that some of that is due to the PC port stuff. That's just how it works. Bugs happen more with ports because usually they just, it's a push a button to compile it for a different environment. So once you look into the whole how ports work thing, cynicism is only one small word to describe how you feel. And it doesn't usually do it justice. It's usually very lazy. And so that is an unfortunate aspect of, I think, how Gears of War was handled in this particular case. So I'm hopeful. I am very hopeful that eventually, people will start to develop exclusively for the PC, or at the very least, if not exclusively, for the PC enough that ports are from the PC to other games, as opposed to the other way around. When people say console port, at least when I say console port, I don't necessarily mean it was released for a console and then after the fact it was ported to the PC. Usually what I'm talking about when I say that is it was designed for a console, even if it was released alongside a PC version at the same time. If you're designing something for a console, let's take Halo Wars 2 or Halo Wars 1. I'm pretty sure... Well, no, I think Halo Wars 2 actually was the one that was released for PC alongside its console counterpart. So just take the second game. That's an example of a game that was 100% a console port, even though it was released for PC natively, even though it has mouse support, even though it was localized properly where you don't have, like, press X to jump or whatever, press X to give your unit an order. Like, oh no, it's actually telling me to left click and right click. Like, the user interface was not changed. The game's functionality was heavily limited by the fact that it was designed for console hardware and for console inputs. And nobody... gave a fuck enough to provide PC users who are used to playing an RTS with mouse and keyboard an opportunity to use that hardware to anywhere close to its full extent, where like half the time you can't even click on the minimap. Just crazy shit that you'd think you would be able to do since you have a mouse and keyboard. Now, I don't know to what degree they've patched that since, but that was a pretty big issue when you first play the game, and it's just so obvious that they didn't give a shit at that point. And it's actually the same publisher as Gears of War, so maybe there is some element of maybe there is something that's been related there. Much like the Halo franchise, actually, Gears of War has since been secured as a Microsoft IP. And Epic Games has divested themselves away from it. I think their last game for the franchise was Judgment. I can look that up. It does look like the first games created by the Coalition, which is like the in-house Microsoft studio for Gears of War, the same way that, what was that company for 343 Industries? That's the one that took over Halo after Bungie left. And it looks like the first game that they released was Gears of War Ultimate Edition, which is a remaster of Gears of War 1 that we just played, and Gears of War 4, and then they're playing, they've got Gears 5 and Gears Tactics and whatever else. So that's great. So yeah, it seems like, just like Halo, at some point the franchise got big enough as a moneymaker, big enough as a commercial success, to not require for Microsoft to just basically say, like, we want to start releasing these really, really quickly, really, really fast, very frequently, and that means that we're going to get an in-house developer to do it, and, whatever else went on behind the scenes, maybe Epic wasn't interested in that, maybe there was some other thing souring the business relationship, but it's interesting that just looking at the surroundings of this franchise, and particularly of this title, and you start to see, like, how this pertains to the overall industry of game development, and, what with PC porting and deleted scenes being acted as DLC or bonus content or whatever, and all this other stuff is just, it's very peculiar, especially when you look at it from the lens of somebody who played this initially as a console gamer primarily. Obviously, I played a lot of StarCraft and RTS stuff on a PC, but I didn't have a powerful enough PC to handle modern games, quote unquote, at that time. And so I was mostly, experiencing the modern AAA experience back in that console generation as a console gamer. I wasn't really a PC gamer at that point, for all intents and purposes. And so it's very interesting to look back at that. It was kind of a nostalgia trip in that sense. And I can understand why people liked Gears of War, actually. I can sort of understand why console gamers liked it. I can speak to that a little bit as somebody who previously did enjoy the game when I was playing it in console many, many years ago, admittedly, because I got it at launch, I believe. So what was that? I was I think it was like 13 or 14 or something like that, maybe even younger than that, maybe 12 or 11 when I was playing it. So it's a very long time ago. It's weird to think of Gears of War so old, considering it doesn't feel like it was that old. It feels like it's a little bit more recent than it was. But like I said, I think I can speak a little bit to why people enjoy Gears of War. And I think it's important to understand that, because I definitely didn't enjoy my time with it. I found like it was a huge time waste. And I would actually compare it to Dead Space, not in the sense that like the gameplay was anything like it, but the idea that when I was deciding whether or not to recommend a Dead Space, I decided I don't really know if I could recommend it on its own merits. It would have to be like, in order to better understand where the franchise went, maybe you could go back and play or watch the first Dead Space game so that you can have some grounding information about like what the franchise began with, and that can help color your understanding of the future titles. That's basically the only thing I could think of for Gears of War 1. Like, by itself, it does not stand on its own. Maybe for multiplayer, like that is a distinction, because obviously Dead Space didn't have any. But Gears of War, single player wise, was just an utter failure in my opinion. However, I do understand that there was some production value and there was some effort that was placed into the game. Certainly not the bonus content, but definitely the main story had some degree of class to it that other games failed to achieve. And maybe it was just actually the standard at the time that you would put some effort into your single-player content. But we've all played some modern titles. Like, I played more recently the two Homefront games, and neither of those games really had much class when it came to their single-player experiences. Can't speak for the multiplayer in either title. I don't even remember if the first game had multiplayer. But the second game, I didn't play the multiplayer. Gears of War, I played both single-player and multiplayer. I played the multiplayer quite a bit, actually. And, the era of shouting, I fucked your mother over Xbox 360 headsets was quite endearing, quite an experience that I would recommend to anybody when you're 13. But after that, it kind of loses its luster. But when it comes to playing Gears of War, it is a very strange game in terms of balance. I read somewhere at the time that even though Gears of War had a bunch of interesting or novel concepts, like the active reload system, which was discussed at length in the playthrough, you didn't really see too many people giving Gears of War's multiplayer a fair shout. At least that was my take at the time. Somebody had said, on a forum that I frequented at the time that Gears of War sort of regresses to the basic idea of if you have the rocket launcher, you are God for that amount of time. And that was definitely true. It was just weird how the boom shot worked, but once you knew how it worked, with it having an arc and the splash radius feeling inconsistent somewhat, as we found out in our playthrough, as long as you knew where it was, and as long as the netcode wasn't too terrible, which it certainly wasn't great, you would tend to be able to be God and just one-hit enemies. And, they didn't even get downed most of the time. They would just, explode into giblets or however you say it. And that was just how it was working. But it was also a game where you could just chainsaw somebody. And I always thought that was a little interesting, where you can, it's a very lengthy animation. You are very vulnerable during it. But if you isolate somebody on a 1v1 and you have a Lancer and they don't, or they just don't have it equipped, and they don't expect you to come around the corner and chainsaw them, like either that's a really, really stupid move and you just die, sort of like trying to knife somebody in CSGO or something, or it's just a literal instant kill. And that's very, very interesting to me that they went for that. I think it's very silly. Maybe it fits the setting of being really grim and edgy, and you could definitely tell by the color palette that they were really going for something like that, very grim dark. But I can't imagine just trying to design a multiplayer scene around a weapon that one hits in melee with a really long animation. There's a lot of really long animations in this game, and so I really can't imagine trying to play it on a competitive high level, especially since I've been mostly consuming Counter-Strike and Brood War related esports content for the past years. And to me, both of these games are about precision, and the animations aren't typically very lengthy in these games, and so you don't really have a complete lack of control. Obviously, Counter-Strike's a bit more of an allegory since it's a shooter. It is an FPS as opposed to a third-person shooter, but despite its perspective difference, I do feel like Counter-Strike is a nice allegory. You look at how smooth all of the animations are, how quick everything is, how you can cancel certain animations like the AWP, the Arctic, I think it's like Arctic Winter Rifle or something. I don't remember what the fuck it stands for. But the sniper rifle in that game, you can quick scope, you can no scope, obviously. But if you want to cancel an animation in that game, as soon as you fire, you switch to your knife or some other weapon, and then you immediately switch back to your op. And when you do that, you can then fire again faster. And it also completely removes the scope much faster than before, and so you can move around a little bit more. And, high-level players do that to a very, stunning amount of, almost no latency between the inputs. They're very, very quick with it. You can't even, come up with something that's even remotely comparable in Gears of War. Like, switching weapons or whatever obviously takes some time in that game. And even though it's not that much time, and even though Counter-Strike has these delays before you can start firing again because there's the time for you to pull the weapon out and, get it primed for firing, it's still much more responsive. It feels much different. It feels much more like, if you fucked up a timing, it really is your fault because you didn't remember what the timing was. It's very instinctive. Whereas maybe because of the perspective in Gears of War being third person over the shoulder, the perspective isn't, doesn't really help the game with its animations, and its reads feel more just reasonable. Maybe a first person Gears of War would have been a little bit more intimate in that respect. But it probably would have sacrificed some elements of the narrative where you wouldn't really have been able to see Marcus Phoenix, the main character, as the same way that you did. And that's why, again, I think people liked this game, is that the story mode actually was quite, like I said, it had some class. It had some element of it where it felt like there was effort put into it. The voice acting was, like I said, pretty solid. There was a couple of lines that I definitely would have had retakes, but I can't even really remember them now, and I don't know if that's because the game was forgettable, or if just because the voice acting was good enough that it sort of washes out. It's fine. I thought that the performances were fine. Obviously, I gave the example of the drunk people being really overacted and comical, but everything else I felt like was solid enough or high enough quality. Like either it was average or above average. And that is a good sign, because most of the time in games you have really, really poor voice acting. Most of the times in any sort of creative expression, you tend to have poor acting overall. And so I thought that the acting was fine in Gears of War, and I thought that helped carry the experience, actually, because you weren't really interested in the setting that much. You weren't really interested in the plight of the characters per se, but the characters themselves were interesting. And so by extension, you were able to stomach the setting, and you were able to put up with the plight of the characters because you wanted to see where they would go next, and you had some sort of attachment to them, perhaps. It was a lot easier to relate to them than in other titles that I've played that have had similar surrounding elements, like the setting being kind of boring and the plight being kind of silly, like the plot basically of the game being kind of pointless, feeling meandering. Definitely criticisms that can be levied at Gears of War, but the characters sort of carried the experience and made it so that sort of washed away at the end. That sort of fell away. You did admittedly forget about that stuff because a lot of it was very forgettable, but the characters felt pertinent enough and meaningful enough that it didn't really bother you as much as it would have had those characters not have that same level of voice acting. And I think the script was okay as well. Certainly, I'm sure there was somebody directing these characters. Otherwise, it would just be a couple of standouts here and there, and the overall would not have felt as tight and as strong. Whereas I feel like there's probably a voice director that is somewhere in here. I don't see his name in the credits here, but I'm sure there's got to be somebody who is responsible for that being strong enough. And so that's probably one of the main reasons why this game felt, fresh, I guess, is not only is it third person, and most shooters at the time were first person, and not only does it seem to be character driven, but the characters are also like being voiced by intelligible people, I should say. It feels like you can understand where these characters are coming from. You don't break immersion that much. Obviously, it was undone partially by really, really poor AI, where we were watching Dom spin around and freeze in the air and stuff, and that's not great. But just in terms of like what you remember outside of the bugs, which sort of automatically can be discarded, especially at the time when I was playing this initially, and especially when you're on console, and maybe that stuff doesn't happen as much because of the consistency of the hardware. You're not going to be accounting for a bunch of different variances. Like, for all I know, that my graphics card has something to do with it because they optimized this for fucking NVIDIA. I don't know. I didn't really look. But there's any number of issues with the AI and all that stuff that can certainly undercut the communication of how intelligent or competent or just what the personality is of a character. But when you put that to one side, just looking at it in retrospect, I think the characters were fine, the script was fine, and the voice acting was fine, and all of that works to make people feel like they can get attached without like sort of feeling guilty about it. You know what I mean? Motorcycle. I think I've discussed before the idea that what I want out of my own stories when I'm sitting down to develop something is I want people to not have to turn their brain off in order to enjoy the game. I want them to not have to turn their brain off in order to enjoy the story, especially. And that's really the main thing, is I want my characters and my story moments, my big memorable moments in the game to, be enjoyable for whoever's watching or playing, insofar as they don't have to say, I really like that part, but there's all this other stuff surrounding it that makes it kind of, lessens the impact, makes it feel cheapened in that respect. I don't want to cheapen the moment with really, really shitty surrounding elements, and so I want everything to be really strong and everything to be in service to these moments and to these characters and to their developments. I didn't really feel like there was much development in the game, but there were a couple of, enjoyable moments in the title, and certainly they were cheapened by everything else. But I think that that's a good way to explain it. Like, you want your moments to be there, and you want them to be, having the full impact, but you also want people to not feel guilty about enjoying those moments, and to not feel like they need to have a bunch of qualifying statements surrounding those moments. You don't want to have an asterisk next to your moments. You want it just to be saying, like, this is a really epic moment. It's our fucking namesake is Epic Games. We make epic games, man. We make this epic moment. And you don't want to have an asterisk next to that says, like, but as soon as you think about it in this way, it immediately falls apart. It's like, that's not what you want to happen. So, whether or not I'm successful on a personal level, I feel like that is a reasonable goal to strive towards, and one that was not met in this particular title. And that's why I think that, even though people were able to get into this game, even though it was quite accessible, and even though it had QTEs and it's fucking reloading, I still think I understand why people enjoyed it. I also still think it was a big failure in that respect. It was not successful in and of itself. By itself, Gears of War is not an enjoyable experience. But like I said, maybe it is worth experiencing just so that we can say we understand where people are coming from going into Gears of War 2, where the developers are coming from going into that title, and what they put forward in there. Unfortunately, unlike Dead Space, I can't actually play Gears of War 2 or Gears of War 3. Those games haven't released for PC. I may look into playing the Ultimate Edition because, as I've seen here, it apparently does change the gameplay experience, unlike the Halo remaster that was apparently 1-to-1 in that respect. Maybe it added some bonus content, but the core gameplay experience is the same. Whereas I see some mention of the fact that a number of improvements to the game, including updates to the gameplay from later titles and enhanced graphics. So besides the enhanced graphics, which I didn't really talk too much about it in the review or in the game. Like a lot of shit was fucked up in terms of texture disparity, in terms of the resolution. But I felt like the game was okay looking. It wasn't really that great. There's a lot of stretchiness, especially on enemies, like the enemies that were larger than humans. But it wasn't really something that you looked at for too long, because the set pieces kept you moving pretty quickly, despite the fact that the checkpoints may have been placed poorly, and despite the fact that the story may have interrupted itself a lot with the cutscenes and stuff. I felt like the set pieces were kind of boring. I felt like the gameplay never got into a good flow, but the set pieces did keep you moving throughout the game pretty quickly, so you didn't really have that much time to gawk at how good or bad the visuals were, essentially. And oftentimes you'll see that as a crutch for developers and designers who don't want to be held accountable for their environment design and their level design, even in terms of how the art works with the level. They'll just have you rush through it and make it very linear. Whereas if it's something that players can experience a lot, like, again, a Counter-Strike map is something that people are going to play a lot because it's a multiplayer map, you would expect them to have those areas be locked down a little bit more, because those are more like an open world experience or a multiplayer experience. We're going to be playing it a lot. And to that effect, I think some of the better looking areas in the game were probably the ones that they reused from multiplayer maps later on. And I didn't look at the multiplayer map, so I can't really talk about that. I didn't look at it in my playthrough, that is. I don't remember any glaring issues when I did play it very long ago on the Xbox 360, but a number of the graphical errors were, again, probably a result of the port as opposed to the original team, the original make of the game. So I'm not 100% sure what that all equals out to in terms of the graphics. I definitely feel like they could have done better, but it was also a game that held up okay. Mostly the issue was color grading and maybe some gameplay communication here and there, like in terms of readability. Didn't always know where enemies were and where they were shooting me from, but you replay the same section enough times because you keep dying, you eventually know where shit is. And so at that point, it just comes down to rote memorization, which is not a great and elegant way of communicating your information to the player, but there were so few enemies on screen at any one time that it kind of didn't matter, I guess, is the best way that I can put that. So what else can I talk about when it comes to gameplay communication? Like I said, the flow was never really established. Dying felt really, really poor because there were some deaths that you had that you definitely could have recovered if your AI were, able to pick you up. I felt that was a really silly mechanic and something that they obviously added in the first place. In the later titles, your allies could pick you up, and I think you could crawl around as well, whereas in this game you were stuck to the ground like a magnet. You stuck to everything like a magnet in this game. It's very annoying. Especially since I think they assume a certain amount of imprecision out of the player because it's a console port, whereas you can be a little bit more fine-tuned with your orientation. Your sexual orientation there could be a little bit better, I think, with PC. Now, again, it's not omnidirectional. You do have to use WASD and some combination thereof, but the levels were not really ever making use of radial covers, so I don't there's a couple of instances where you can run around flower pots and stuff, but that was actually mostly in the bonus content, believe it or not. And so I don't see why WASD wouldn't be sufficient for that, especially since your movement by nature is so sluggish. But instead, they just stuck you to a bunch of shit, and they also bound a bunch of the keys to the same thing. I complained about this so many times during the playthrough, but double tapping any of the directional keys causes you to roll, and then if you double tap and hold it or something, it causes you to run, but holding spacebar also runs, tapping spacebar also rolls in the direction that you're going in, and I don't know why you need so many repeats. And the fact that spacebar also puts you into cover, but you don't really know when the range of cover is. There was no indication, and it was not really that consistent in certain areas. You don't really know where the collision begins for you to press spacebar to take cover, and where it begins to press spacebar to roll. They should have just bound those to different keys. They had so many keys available on the keyboard. It really boggles the mind why they didn't. I didn't bother doing it because it's a short game, but if it had been longer, I really would have been angry about that. So, not really much else you can say, I guess. So, when it comes to the overall gameplay expression, I had a lengthy conversation about this towards it's not really that lengthy, but it was in the credits rant. I discussed the whole active reload system. It is true that the active reload system does give you something to do when you're out of combat, but I don't think you need that. Again, looking at Counter-Strike, the reload speeds vary depending on the game. For example, most of the cheap weapons and pistols and stuff reload faster than the more expensive rifles. It's to give you some sort of positional advantage and make it so that if you spend your bullets, in a very poor manner or a very inefficient manner, you're punished for it. If you, spend your more powerful bullets from your more powerful weapons. And so you have to, then reload for a longer period of time, and that can give your opponents time to reposition and stuff. Gears of War evidently that didn't matter as much. Positioning wasn't something that was valued as much, and the game moved much slower. But in CSGO, you don't have anything like that. In Counter-Strike, you don't have any sort of varying reload speeds depending on your active reloads. The closest thing like that is just swapping your weapons at a certain point in the animation. And there are certain weapons where that's sort of diminishing returns or actually slower, like most pistols, for example. My understanding is it actually takes you longer to arm the pistol sometimes after getting to the point where you're done in the reload animation, as opposed to just letting the reload animation finish. But maybe it's just that it's like a wash in that respect. Like there's not one that's significantly better than the other. Either way, the point is, the animations are not really a big deal. The reloading is not really a big deal in many other shooters where you need to add some other element of interactivity that is tantamount to a QuickTime event in order to have some more action going on there. Really, they could have just made it so that the gameplay loop is a little bit more enjoyable to experience and a little bit more interactive, a little bit more engaging than just sitting behind cover and spraying and stuff, as opposed to worrying about adding some other shit in there. I feel like it's a crutch. It's actually going to be used as a crutch later on in the other games. This is my opinion. This is what I'm worrying about. My fear, my premonition, is we're going to play the later games eventually and find out that they didn't really change the gameplay loop that much, to the point where it feels really shitty still to sit behind cover and take a billion hits and have your bullets be incredibly inaccurate because it's a console shooter, and so they expect some aim assist or something. I don't know. It removes the responsibility from the player to have aim assist. Obviously, you don't want that, especially in a PC game, where it's totally reasonable to be precise about that stuff. But just the idea that you have so little mobility options means that you kind of are stuck behind cover for longer. And maybe they just realized that, hey, we actually need to add some sort of QTE system for reloading, because otherwise the player's literally doing nothing for like 2-3 seconds during our reload animations. They're just sitting behind cover, and that's really, really boring. But instead of addressing the root causes, they just put a Band-Aid fix on it. And I feel like that is a Band-Aid fix. The active reload system feels more like a Band-Aid fix from a design standpoint, like a developmental standpoint, than anything else that I've seen from any other shooter to try to address that. It would have been much more reasonable, I think, to just figure out some way to make cover a little bit less valuable. And you could do that situationally. You don't have to change anything about cover itself. You could just make it so that the player is more mobile and so that they can do stuff during reload times that isn't shooting, sure, but can still be useful. I also thought that since you had access to so many weapons at the same time, you had a pistol and two primary weapons, you definitely had the ability to use that to your advantage. Picking up weapons in this game also was a very lengthy animation. Dodging through cover was a lengthy animation. And it just feels like all these animations make it more attractive to sit behind your cover and do your active reload QTE, or just reload normally. If you didn't interact with the QTE system at all, and you just let it reload normally, that's more attractive as an option for staying alive. Not very much for keeping yourself engaged and not bored. But it's a more attractive option for staying alive than trying to move around and reposition and switch weapons and whatever else, because you're just going to get annihilated, especially since it seems like the bullets are hit scan, even though there are tracers. It seems like the bullets are just hit scan stuff, which is fine. But if you have hit scan bullets and your balancing is such that your enemies are bullet sponges and you just die very, very quickly, I mean, that's not very engaging. That's more encouragement for sitting behind cover. It's basically Halo and Legendary in that respect, where you're just going to be behind cover and you're going to be trying to gimmick enemies. And that's what I did. So it was obviously a successful strategy in that respect. It was something that you had to do in order to find success in most cases. And obviously a lot of the boss battles were just really, really, really gimmicky set pieces, like the Corpser scene where I was dying over and over again because I didn't know what the fuck to do. I just had to keep pushing it back. But why is it running back from me when it can just crush me? I don't get it. Enemies just don't behave the way that you would expect. They're very, very passive in some respects. The more aggressive enemies were actually those wretches, and those are the ones that fucked me up the most, especially those exploding ones, because those are the ones that you would expect to, they die quickly, sure, but they're the only ones that actually push in and try to attack you. Whereas if at any point those ranged enemies actually tried to push in and be aggressive, because they're so fucking meaty, because they take so many hits to kill, they would have absolutely annihilated me. And of course, in the rare instances where I get close enough for them to start running at me, they usually do annihilate me in the playthrough. You can just go back and look. And so like that's an example where, you know, you could have toned down the amount of ammo required, maybe added more enemies, which may have been a technical limitation. But if you had more enemies on screen, but you devalued the amount of HP that they each individually had, and kept them more in line with what the player has in terms of HP, then suddenly you're empowering the player to feel like they're actually, you know, being a bit more competent at the game because they're able to gun down more than one enemy per, you know, clip. And then you can even make ammo a little bit more scarce, because the idea is you should be like swapping between a bunch of weapons and stuff depending on what's available. Rather than, you know, if you need an entire clip of an assault rifle to kill one enemy or down one enemy or get one enemy ready to die, just to whittle down their HP bars, then, you know, you can see where that could be a really annoying aspect, and you would need a lot of ammo for that, especially like if you combine the fact that there's really, really high time to kill with low ammo, then you can see where that would be an issue, especially since AI seem to have infinite ammo. But so say you make these adjustments to the gameplay loop, you lower their health, you add more enemies so that, you know, they are still a threat. You lower the amount of ammo that the player can have in reserve, and maybe you tweak the number of ammo in each gun's clip or whatever. And then you make enemies just more aggressive. They try to, you know, attack you with more stuff and more vigor. They charge at you. They, you know, different ones do different things. You can see where this could be a much more engaging experience that would actually force you to leave your cover a little bit more and make it so that that wasn't the most optimal design decision for your strategy. So I would have appreciated a game that was a little bit more like that in that respect. And these are very simple changes that you could have made to make the game more tolerable. It wouldn't have fixed all the problems, obviously, but it would have made the game more experienceable, more enjoyable, rather. It would have made the gameplay experience more enjoyable. There you go. I can speak English, I promise. And so when it comes to handling it in that respect, I don't understand why nobody did that. I don't understand why that wasn't one of the builds, or like nobody even came to that conclusion that maybe we should try this. Unfortunately, I don't think I can have access to like changing these fields myself. Maybe somebody who's a bit more familiar with the PC version of this game can let me know what you can actually edit in the level editor. Like maybe if you can change a gameplay constants in that way, I would be interested in maybe doing something like that. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like it would make so much sense to do something like that, and maybe make it so that, you know, movement speed or something like that was a little bit higher in general. It just normal walking speed was a little bit higher, so that you weren't as encouraged to, again, stay behind cover because enemies could approach you much faster. Just lowering their HP, though, that would make sense. The fact that they have these wretches as well that are meant to kind of flush you out of cover because they don't give a shit about taking hits. They're really just these like suicide melee units. Like, that's totally fine. You just, you know, that's actually a useful tool for flushing players out of cover. It's just that when cover's literally the only solution to winning, it feels like really, really bad to have a hard counter to that, basically. It's not really a hard counter, I guess, because you can pick them up beforehand, but in some of the more open battlefields, that's what it felt like if wretches were on the field. I actually think that they should have had more variety, not just in the weapons that they gave the player and the weapons that the enemies used, but just in the number of enemy types that were on the field. Now, obviously, this is partially rectified in the later titles, but I feel like this is something that they could have explored in this game. I will be interested to see whether or not the Ultimate Edition actually has more enemy types, because like we had the drone and the Theron and the Grenadier, and then they had like the Grenadier Elite, I think, which was the armored one. And I think that's really it for the there's the snipers that obviously had less HP. There was the turret guards. I don't know if they had anything different over normal drones in terms of stats. I just know that they were the only units that could use turrets for some reason. But like I don't really think that was there's obviously the boomer, right? And then I think that was everything. So I'm really curious as to how that was approached, basically. You know, whether or not there were any concepts for new units, like the Wretch and the Lambent Wretch obviously were in there as well. But if there were concepts for any other monsters, it would be interesting to see those. I also, just as a parting note, feel like set pieces are really overdone. We had 2 vehicle sections in this game. Or no, we only had 1 vehicle section in this game. And that 1 vehicle section was obviously the Junker when we were driving that around. And just set pieces in general break up the flow in a very destructive manner, I feel like. They're sort of like an installation mission in an RTS. That's what it feels like to me. It's like a complete distraction from the core gameplay. And it in a game where you're already really struggling to get into a flow or a loop where you're actually playing the game whatever the game of Gears of War looks like, it really helps to skew everything even further, and that's not what you want to be doing. I would lastly say, if they had found a way to work in stuff like the Brumac, stuff like the Corpser, into your more like average, everyday combat scenarios, it would be really, really cool to see if we could find a way with this, sort of new game state in that sense, where you are lowering the time to kill for enemies and you're raising their aggression and making them move forward faster and lowering ammo and stuff. Like, it would be really interesting, I think, at that point to see how you could work those ones in. And that would be what I would want a developer to look at Gears of War as and say, like, this is where I want it to really shine. I don't really remember if they do the last part of that where they try to work in those larger monsters more organically into these battle scenes. I think it is still primarily set piece driven in the later titles, but I do feel like maybe there's a little bit more open-ended gameplay in that respect. Maybe the levels are a little bit more open-ended in that respect, but I guess we'll only wait and see. Hopefully at some point they will be releasing for the PC version, or the Coalition will release PC versions of those games, I should say. But I don't know about that one. I'm not sure if there's any plans there. I haven't looked into that, so maybe somebody else can tell me. And that'll be it for me. Gears of War was a very strange title. Like I said, I wouldn't really recommend it unless you were going to take a look at the other games and you wanted some sort of grounding. It's a very short game, obviously, especially if you play the console version. It's at that point, it's probably only like 5-6 hours. If you're not as bad as me, it's even shorter. And so, yeah, I don't know. That's it, man.